you've got an asylum case pending with the asylum office, then you need to see this video because the government made an announcement that's going to affect most people at their asylum interview. In this video, I'm going to tell you about the significant change concerning interpretation and tell you why the agency that handles asylum interviews, USCIS, is reversing itself and going back to a policy that it had abandoned in recent years. Be sure to watch this video to the end because I'm going to share with you some really important tips concerning this topic. I'm Brian Manning, and I used to be an asylum officer with the government, but now, as an asylum lawyer, I help immigrants all over the country to secure their future in America through asylum. So USCIS, the part of the Department of Homeland Security that runs the asylum offices, recently announced a big change to the way that asylum interviews are going to be conducted, and it concerns interpretation. If you're going to carry out your interview in a language other than English, then you've got to use an interpreter. Someone who will interpret into your native language everything that the officer says and who will render in English everything that you say. Now remember, interpretation isn't just for people who speak little or no English. It may be a good idea to do your interview in your own language using interpretation, even if you do speak English pretty well or even quite fluently. The asylum interview is incredibly important, and it's also probably going to be a lot harder than you're expecting. So you really need to ensure that communication doesn't trip you up. You need to understand everything that the officer says, and you want to be able to express yourself clearly. For that reason, it may be worth using an interpreter even if your English is pretty solid. All right, so what exactly is this recent change concerning interpretation? Well, as of September 13, 2023, if you're going to do your asylum interview in a language other than English, then you've got to bring your own interpreter with you to the interview. Now, that means it's up to you to find someone adequate and ensure that they actually show up and then pay them, assuming that you use a professional interpreter and not just a friend or family member. And this is different from the past few years, but it's actually a return to the status quo. You see, traditionally, USCIS has required asylum applicants to bring their own interpreter to the asylum interview. But in September of 2020, they changed that and said, well, actually, no, you don't need to bring an interpreter. We'll provide one for you if you want to do your interview in a language other than English. In fact, they actually prohibited applicants from bringing their own interpreter. You couldn't even if you wanted to. Well, that was true for almost all asylum applicants. You see, in the interview notices that USCIS sent out to tell you that your interview had been scheduled, they would say, if you want to use interpretation and you speak one of the languages on the list below, then you can't bring an interpreter. Rather, we, USCIS, will provide one for you. And then on this list were the most commonly used languages in asylum interviews, including languages like Spanish, French, Russian, Arabic, Mandarin, Hindi, Urdu, and Farsi. If you spoke a language other than one of those and you wanted to use it at your interview, well, you could bring your own interpreter. But if you spoke one of those languages and you wanted to use it at your interview, then you would show up and USCIS would provide an interpreter for you. Now, there were two major benefits of this. One, it was free, as USCIS provided the interpreter and did not pass along that cost to the asylum applicant. And two, the interpretation was usually pretty good. You see, USCIS uses contractors who work for big companies that provide interpretation services to the government and to businesses. And these folks are usually pretty good. I've heard many interviews interpreted in Spanish, a language that I speak, and I can say that these contractors provided by USCIS usually do high quality work. Now, this setup was used until September 13, 2023, at which time the government started requiring everyone to bring an interpreter and stop providing them to people. So why the change? Well, the shift to providing people with interpretation started in September of 2020 as a response to COVID. For health reasons, the government wanted to have as few people as possible in the room. So they used the contract interpreters who participate by telephone. They're not physically present for the interview. But 3 years on, the government felt the COVID risk had more or less passed, so it went back to requiring people to bring their own interpreters. By the way, if you want to maximize your chances for asylum success, then be sure to hit the subscribe button and bell notification so that you don't miss the insights that I share on this channel. Okay, before we unpack this fully, let me stress that what we're talking about today, the requirement to bring an interpreter to your asylum interview, if you're going to use a language other than English, does not apply to cases in immigration court. That's a different scenario. You see, over in immigration court, interpretation is always provided by the government, free of charge. If your case is before an immigration judge, you cannot use your own interpreter. What we're talking about today are so-called affirmative asylum cases, which are for people who are not in deportation proceedings. We're talking about cases pending before USCIS, where you're going to have an asylum interview at an asylum office and not a situation where you're going to immigration court. All right, now that that's clear, let me take this opportunity to stress just how important it is to have a good interpreter. As both an asylum officer and as an asylum lawyer, I've seen interpretation make a huge difference in many asylum cases. In fact, I've seen people get denied asylum because of poor interpretation. You really don't want that to happen to you. So if you're going to use an interpreter, you really need to use a good one. So how do you know if an interpreter is good? Well, for starters, you need to hire a professional and ideally someone who has experience interpreting in the asylum office, where a lot of highly specialized vocabulary is used. It's true that you can take a friend or family member or an acquaintance to interpret for you. The rules don't prohibit this. In fact, the rules only prohibit you from using as your interpreter, your attorney, anyone who's going to be a witness for you in your asylum case, a representative of your home country's government, and anyone who currently has an asylum claim pending with USCIS and has not yet had their own asylum interview. So technically, yes, you could have a friend or family member help you if they don't fall into one of those categories, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. I know it's tempting. People want to save money and they may feel more comfortable having someone they know interpret for them. But please trust me when I say that it's not a good idea. Your friend or family member probably won't be nearly as good as a professional interpreter. Also, asylum officers tend to look skeptically upon an interpreter who knows the applicant personally. They think that the interpreter might not be wholly objective, that they might try to frame things in a way that benefits you. So go with a pro, okay? It's worth paying maybe a couple or a few $100s and going through the hassle it takes to arrange it all. Your asylum case is too important to your future, okay? Take the long view on this. If you're ready to take the next step and get help with your asylum case, then call my office today. That number is 713-352-1593. And remember, we help people all over the country, so it doesn't matter where you live. Call us now to schedule an asylum strategy session so that we can help you secure your future in America through asylum. Again, I'm Brian Manning, and it's an honor to serve you in your asylum journey.